The cry in the darkness. The ruined city was silent. Broken towers stretched toward the sky, their edges jagged and sharp. The ground was covered in dust, metal scraps, and the memories of a civilization long gone. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying the scent of fire and destruction. Commander Ethan Carter pulled his jacket closer around his body. The mission was over. His team had finished scanning the ruins, looking for any remaining technology. There was nothing left, only ghosts of the past. His radio crackled. "Ethan, we're ready to leave. The ship is waiting." He sighed, glancing around one last time. That's when he heard it. A sound so small, so weak, yet so full of pain. A cry. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A soft, desperate wail. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned his head, listening carefully. "Is someone there?" he called out. His voice echoed in the empty streets. Silence. He stepped forward. His boots crunched against broken glass. He waited, holding his breath. Then the cry came again. This time, it was closer. Ethan swallowed hard. Every part of him said to leave. His team was waiting. This place was dead. Nothing lived here. But the cry didn't stop. Something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. He followed the sound, stepping over fallen beams and shattered walls. The air was thick with dust. The sky above was dark with storm clouds, blocking out the stars. Then, in the middle of the wreckage, he saw it. A small bundle wrapped in silver cloth, hidden beneath the remains of a collapsed structure. The cloth was torn, revealing a tiny face. A baby. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Its skin was a soft shade of blue, and its 4 glowing eyes blinked weakly at him. A strange symbol glowed faintly on its forehead. Its tiny fingers reached out, trembling. He knelt beside it. Oh God! The baby was freezing. It was barely breathing. Abandoned. Left to die. Ethan's fingers hovered over it, unsure. This wasn't human. This wasn't part of his mission. His radio crackled again. "Ethan, why aren't you back yet?" He hesitated before pressing the button. I found something." A pause. Then his second-in-command, Lieutenant Harris, spoke. "Found what?" Ethan swallowed. "A child. An alien child." Static filled the radio. Then Harris's voice came back, sharp and cold. "Leave it." Ethan stiffened. "What?" "It's not our problem. Carter, we came here for data, not to play hero. That thing was left behind for a reason." Ethan looked down at the baby. Its breathing was shallow. Its tiny chest barely moved. "If I leave, it dies," Ethan said. "Then let it." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had seen war. He had seen cruelty. But this was something else. He reached down, gently lifting the baby into his arms. It was so light, so fragile. The baby let out a small, weak cry, and suddenly a sound echoed in the ruins. A deep, low growl. Ethan's muscles tensed. He turned his head sharply. Something was watching him. A shadow shifted between the broken buildings. A shape, large and moving too fast. Ethan's pulse spiked. He stepped back, cradling the baby protectively. His radio flared again. "Carter, get back to the ship. Now." Ethan didn't respond. He was already running. Behind him, the growl turned into a snarl. Then the sound of claws scraping against metal. Ethan tightened his grip on the child. He didn't know what was out there. He didn't know what he had just stepped into. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving this baby behind. As he sprinted through the ruins, the shadows behind him began to move. And the hunt had begun. The unseen threat. The ruins trembled. The growl Ethan had heard was not just his imagination. It was real, and it was close. The wind howled through the broken city, kicking up dust and debris. The baby in his arms let out another weak cry, its tiny body trembling against his chest. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to move. He wasn't alone anymore. Something in the darkness had its eyes on him. His radio crackled again. "Ethan, respond. What the hell is happening down there?" He gritted his teeth. "I don't know yet, but we got company." Another growl echoed through the ruins, this time from a different direction. There was more than one. Ethan's mind raced. He needed to reach his ship. His team was waiting. But his every move was being watched, stalked. He turned, scanning the area. The shadows between the broken buildings seemed to move, shifting unnaturally. He caught glimpses of black, spiny shapes, crouched low, their bodies blending into the rubble. Their eyes glowed faintly, tracking his every movement. Predators. Ethan's pulse pounded. He adjusted his grip on the baby and took a slow step backward. The creatures didn't move. They were waiting. Waiting for what? Then it hit him. They were testing him. They weren't attacking yet. They were studying him, deciding if he was a threat or prey. He had no time to hesitate. Ethan turned and ran. His boots pounded against the cracked pavement as he bolted through the ruins, ducking under fallen beams and leaping over debris. The baby whimpered in his arms, its glowing eyes wide with fear. The creatures followed. He could hear them, silent, fast, closing in. His breath came in sharp gasps. His muscles burned as he pushed himself harder. His ship wasn't far, but the ruins were a maze of broken buildings and collapsed streets. A sudden snarl ripped through the air. One of them leaped. Ethan dove forward, barely dodging the attack. Claws scraped against metal where he had just been standing. He rolled, gripping the baby tightly, then sprang back to his feet. No time to stop. He sprinted toward an old structure, its frame half collapsed, but still offering some cover. He ducked inside, pressing his back against the cold stone wall. His breathing was ragged. The creatures slowed, circling outside. They knew he was trapped. Ethan reached for his weapon, a compact plasma pistol strapped to his side. One shot, one chance. He peeked around the edge of the wall. 3 of them, each one taller than a man, their black bodies covered in razor-sharp spikes. Their glowing eyes locked onto him, unblinking. He raised his pistol. Then something unexpected happened. The baby in his arms let out a sudden, high-pitched wail. The sound was unnatural, not just a cry, but something deeper, more powerful. Ethan felt it vibrate through his bones. The air around them seemed to shift, as if reality itself had been disturbed. The creatures froze. Their glowing eyes flickered. For the first time, they hesitated. Then, without warning, they backed away. Ethan's chest rose and fell heavily as he watched them retreat, slipping back into the shadows. Gone. His grip tightened on the baby. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The baby didn't answer. It simply blinked up at him, its strange symbol glowing softly. His radio crackled again. "Ethan, are you there? What's happening?" He pressed the button. "I'm fine. But we have a problem." A long silence. Then Harris spoke. "Explain." Ethan swallowed hard, looking down at the baby. "I don't think this child is ordinary, and whatever just backed off, it wasn't because of me." Another pause. Then, in a serious tone, Harris replied, "Get back to the ship. Now." Ethan was about to move when something even more disturbing happened. The sky above him flashed, a bright streak of red cutting through the darkness. His blood ran cold. That was no natural light. It was a signal flare, and it meant someone else was here. Ethan's grip tightened on the baby. He was running out of time. He had to get off this planet. Fast. The price of mercy. The red streak in the sky faded, but its meaning burned in Ethan's mind. Someone else was here. The wind had changed. The silence that once filled the ruins was gone, replaced by something else, the hum of distant engines. Ethan pressed himself against the cold wall of the broken structure, his pulse pounding. He adjusted his grip on the baby, feeling the warmth of its tiny body against his chest. The infant's 4 glowing eyes flickered, its strange symbol dimming slightly. His radio buzzed again. "Ethan, report." "What was that?" He took a slow breath before responding. "A signal flare. Not ours." Harris cursed. "Damn it. You need to move now. If someone else is here, we don't know if they're friendly." Ethan already knew the answer. They weren't. The flare meant one thing. Someone had spotted him. And they were coming. No time to run. Ethan peered out from behind the rubble, scanning the horizon. His ship was still too far. He had to make a choice: run and risk being seen, or hide and risk being surrounded. Neither option was good. The baby stirred in his arms. Ethan looked down. Its small fingers curled against his chest, and for the first time, its expression changed. It was afraid. Ethan's jaw tightened. If this child was afraid, then the real danger was just beginning. He adjusted his grip on his plasma pistol, holding it close. Then, from the distance, he saw them, figures emerging from the smoke. Tall, armored, their weapons drawn. Alien soldiers. Their leader stepped forward. His armor was silver and black, his face hidden behind a helmet with a thin, glowing visor. His voice echoed through a voice modulator. "Human, drop the child." Ethan didn't move. The soldier took a step closer. "That is not a request." Ethan's fingers tightened on his weapon. "Who are you?" A pause. Then the soldier lifted his head slightly. "We are the Purge." Ethan's stomach twisted. He knew that name. Everyone did. The Purge were not just soldiers. They were hunters. They didn't fight for land, or wealth, or power. They had one mission: to erase anything they deemed dangerous. And right now, they wanted the child. Ethan took a slow step back. "This baby is innocent." The soldier tilted his head. "No, that thing is a mistake." Ethan glanced down at the baby. Its tiny hands clenched into fists. Its glowing eyes flickered with something almost human. He took another step back. The soldier lifted his weapon. "You do not understand what you are holding." Ethan swallowed. "Then explain it to me." The soldier exhaled. "It is not meant to exist. It is an anomaly. A mutation. It was abandoned here for a reason. You, human, have made a mistake." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Maybe, but I'm not leaving it to die." The soldier sighed, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Then you will die with it." Nowhere left to hide. Ethan didn't wait for them to fire. He spun around and ran. Plasma shots screamed past him, hitting the rubble and sending chunks of debris flying. Ethan ducked, shielding the baby with his body as he sprinted through the ruins. His mind raced. He needed cover. He needed time. The baby let out another cry, a strange, high-pitched wail that made the air vibrate. Ethan felt it deep in his bones. Then something invisible swept through the ruins. The alien soldiers staggered, clutching their heads. The air itself seemed to ripple, like heat waves bending reality. Ethan gasped. The baby was doing this. But how? He didn't have time to think. He bolted through the wreckage, leaping over broken beams and sprinting toward a half-collapsed tower. He ducked inside, pressing his back against the cold wall. Outside, the soldiers were recovering. They were still coming. He turned on his radio. "Harris, I need pickup now." Static. Then, "We're coming. Hold your position." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He just had to survive a little longer. A terrible realization. He looked down at the baby. Its tiny chest rose and fell rapidly. Then something terrible happened. The baby opened its mouth and whispered. Not a normal baby sound. Not a cry. Words. Words in a language Ethan didn't understand, but somehow he felt them. It wasn't just speaking. It was communicating. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just some abandoned child. This was something else. something powerful, something the purge was afraid of. He exhaled sharply. "What are you?" he whispered. The baby blinked at him, its eyes glowing softly. Then, outside, the purge soldiers opened fire again. Ethan had no choice. He took a deep breath, held the baby close, and ran straight into the gunfire. Escape into the void. The ruins exploded with light as plasma shots tore through the air, burning into the shattered remains of the ancient city. Ethan ducked low, cradling the baby against his chest as he sprinted through the rubble. He had no time to think, only to move. Behind him, the purge soldiers advanced, their sleek black armor reflecting the glow of their weapons. Their leader barked orders in a harsh, metallic voice. "Do not let him escape. The child must be terminated." Ethan clenched his teeth. Terminated. They didn't even see the baby as a life, just a problem to erase. He vaulted over a collapsed column, landing hard on the cracked pavement. He didn't stop. His ship was still too far. The dust in the air made it difficult to breathe, but he forced his legs to keep moving. The baby trembled in his arms, its tiny fingers clutching at his uniform. Then, the ground in front of him exploded. Ethan threw himself to the side as a plasma grenade detonated, sending chunks of concrete and metal flying. He hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. The baby let out a small cry, but he kept his grip firm, shielding it with his body. "Ethan. Status." His radio crackled with Harris's voice. He coughed, pressing the communicator. "They've got me pinned. I can't make it to the ship." A pause. Then, "New coordinates. There's an old transport tunnel half a click east of your position. We'll meet you there." Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow. Half a click. He could make it, but the purge wouldn't let him go that easily. The hunter arrives. As sound sliced through the chaos, a sharp hiss like metal scraping against metal. Ethan turned, his heart slamming against his ribs. Emerging from the shadows was something different. The purge soldiers stopped firing. Even they seemed to hesitate. A tall, skeletal figure stepped forward. Its armor smoother than the others, almost organic. It carried no weapon, only a long curved blade strapped to its back. Its eyes burned with a sickly golden light. A hunter. Not just any purge soldier. An executioner. Ethan froze. He'd heard of these things. They didn't use guns. They didn't need to. The hunter tilted its head, analyzing him. Then, in a voice that barely sounded human, it spoke. "Human, the child is not yours." Ethan's grip on the baby tightened. "Yeah." He took a step back. "Well, I didn't see anyone else lining up to take care of it." The hunter's head twitched slightly. "The child is dangerous. Give it to us, and you may leave alive." Ethan forced a breath out through his nose. "That's a lie." The hunter's fingers flexed. "Yes." Then it moved. Faster than thought. Ethan barely had time to react before it was on him. A blur of motion. A flash of steel. He twisted to the side, barely dodging the strike. The blade sliced the air where his neck had been. He fired his pistol. The hunter caught the shot in midair. Ethan's eyes widened. Impossible. Then, a deep, thrumming sound filled the ruins. The baby. It wasn't crying this time. It was singing. A strange, harmonic vibration pulsed through the air, distorting the light around them. The hunter staggered. For the first time, it looked uncertain. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and ran. The race to escape. His lungs burned as he sprinted toward the transport tunnel, the baby's hum still vibrating through the air. The purge soldiers were hesitant now, their weapons lowering slightly. Even they didn't understand what was happening. Ethan slid down a crumbled slope, landing hard at the entrance of the tunnel. The metal doors were rusted shut, sealed from years of abandonment. He turned, heart hammering. The hunter was still watching him. The golden eyes flickered. It wasn't chasing him. It was studying the baby. Then, In a voice so quiet Ethan barely heard it, the hunter whispered, "I see now. It should not exist." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Then the baby let out one final pulse of energy. The tunnel doors behind Ethan burst open with a loud groan. Dust and debris rained down as the ancient mechanisms came back to life, opening a path into the underground. His escape. Ethan didn't waste a second. He darted inside, his boots echoing in the darkness. The metal doors slammed shut behind him just as the purged soldiers regained their senses. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The baby cooed softly, its glow dimming. His radio crackled. "Ethan, do you copy?" He swallowed hard, pressing the communicator. "I'm in. I made it." Harris exhaled in relief. "We've got a ship waiting at the other end of that tunnel. Move fast." Ethan pushed himself up. He wasn't safe yet, but for now he had a chance. He glanced down at the baby. It looked back at him with those four strange eyes, its expression unreadable. "What are you?" He didn't know. But one thing was certain. The purge was terrified of it. And that meant one thing. He had to protect it at all costs. The hunter and the human. The air inside the tunnel was thick with dust, the scent of rust and decay lingering in the stale atmosphere. The ancient underground transport system had been abandoned for centuries, its steel walls covered in cracks, cables hanging loosely from the ceiling like dead vines. Ethan Carter didn't slow down. His boots echoed against the metal floor as he sprinted through the dimly lit corridor, the alien baby cradled tightly in his arms. The glow from its four strange eyes cast faint, shifting lights against the tunnel walls. Its tiny fingers twitched, its breath still unsteady from the surge of power it had unleashed moments ago. The metal doors behind him had slammed shut, sealing him inside, cutting off the purged soldiers, for now. But Ethan knew better. They would find a way in. And even worse, the hunter was still out there. Nowhere to hide. His radio crackled. "Ethan, what's your status?" Harris's voice was tense, barely above a whisper. Ethan's breath was heavy. "I made it into the tunnels, heading for extraction." A pause. Then, "You're not alone, are you?" Ethan glanced down at the baby in his arms. "No." Harris exhaled sharply. "Damn it, Carter. Do you know what you're carrying?" Ethan hesitated. He didn't. But he knew one thing. The purge was terrified of it. Before he could respond, a distant sound rumbled through the tunnel. A deep metallic growl. The hunter had followed him. Ethan's grip on his plasma pistol tightened. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He moved faster, his boots crunching against broken debris. The tunnel stretched for miles, but the map in his visor showed an access hatch leading to a maintenance shaft, his only chance to reach the surface before the hunter reached him. The baby stirred in his arms, its glowing eyes flickering with some strange awareness. It knew something was wrong. So did Ethan. Because behind him, the darkness moved. The silent stalker. A chilling whisper slithered through the air, almost too low to hear. Ethan's pulse spiked. He forced himself forward, his muscles aching, but his instincts screamed at him. Too late. A sharp metallic clang echoed from above. Ethan's stomach dropped. He barely had time to react before a black shape dropped from the ceiling, landing soundlessly behind him. The hunter. It stood there, motionless, its golden eyes gleaming like twin flames in the darkness. Its skeletal armor shimmered unnaturally, blending into the tunnel like a living shadow. Ethan whipped around, gun raised. But the hunter didn't attack. It simply watched. Then it spoke. "You run, but you do not understand." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Understand what?" The hunter tilted its head. "The child you hold is not what you think." Ethan took a slow step back. "Then tell me what it is." The hunter's golden eyes flickered. "No." Then, in one swift motion, it lunged. Ethan barely had time to fire before the hunter was on him. A fight for survival. The impact slammed Ethan against the tunnel wall. His vision blurred. The baby let out a sharp cry, and suddenly, a wave of invisible energy pulsed through the air. The hunter staggered back. For the first time, its movements were hesitant. Ethan coughed, forcing himself to his feet. His ribs ached, but he ignored the pain. He lifted his pistol, firing off 3 rapid shots. The first 2 missed. The hunter was too fast. The third grazed its shoulder, but there was no blood. Instead, the wound sealed itself instantly. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What the hell was this thing? The hunter stepped forward again, its movements eerily smooth, as if the fight was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, Ethan noticed something. The baby's symbol was glowing brighter, reacting to the hunter's presence. They knew each other, or rather, the baby recognized what the hunter was. And that terrified Ethan. The truth unfolds. The hunter didn't attack this time. It stood still, watching the child in Ethan's arms. Then, in a voice softer than before, it said, "You think you are saving it, but you are only delaying the inevitable." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. "What do you mean?" The hunter exhaled, the sound like metal grinding against metal. "It is not meant to live." Ethan took a step back. Then why was it left here? The hunter tilted its head again. Because even its own kind feared it. Ethan's heart pounded. That didn't make sense. Why would an entire species abandon their own child? What was so dangerous about a baby? The baby blinked up at the hunter, its glowing eyes reflecting something Ethan couldn't understand. Then suddenly, the walls of the tunnel shook. A deep, thunderous rumble echoed through the underground. The purge had found another way in. More soldiers were coming. Ethan knew he had seconds, maybe less. He locked eyes with the hunter. "Whatever you think this baby is, I'm not letting you kill it." The hunter didn't move. But Ethan saw it. A flicker of hesitation. Then, the ceiling behind them collapsed. The purge was here. Ethan didn't think. He turned and ran, sprinting toward the access hatch with everything he had left. The hunter didn't chase him. But as Ethan disappeared into the darkness, he heard its final words. "Run as far as you can. You will see. In the end, it will not be us who stop you." The baby trembled in his arms. And for the first time, Ethan felt a deep, unsettling fear settle into his bones. Not for himself, but for what he had just taken from this planet. The truth of the child. The underground tunnel shook violently as explosions echoed through the walls, sending loose rubble crashing to the ground. Ethan didn't stop running. The baby in his arms whimpered, its glowing eyes flickering erratically, as if sensing the approaching danger. His lungs burned. His legs ached. But the fear of what was behind him, the purge, the hunter, and whatever truth they were hiding, drove him forward. Up ahead, the access hatch came into view. The metal door was rusted and dented, but it was still intact. His only way out. His radio crackled. "Ethan, we're picking up seismic activity. What the hell is going on down there?" Harris's voice was urgent. Ethan's breath was ragged. The purge found a way in. And they brought something worse with them. A pause. Then, "Doe, you need extraction." Ethan reached the hatch and slammed his hand against the control panel. Nothing happened. He cursed. Of course, it hadn't been used in centuries. His fingers clenched around his plasma pistol. He didn't have time for this. He turned and fired 3 shots into the hatch's control system. Sparks exploded from the panel as the door groaned loudly. It was working. But then, a chill ran up his spine. He turned. The hunter was standing at the other end of the tunnel. Its golden eyes glowed in the darkness, its skeletal armor almost blending into the shadows. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply watched, waiting. The baby in Ethan's arms stirred again. Its tiny fingers twitched. Then, for the first time, it reached out, not toward Ethan, but toward the hunter. A sudden wave of energy rippled through the air, subtle but unmistakable. The hairs on Ethan's arms stood up. The hunter reacted instantly. It took a sharp step back, not out of aggression, but out of caution. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. The hunter feared the child. Before he could think further, the access hatch finally groaned open. A gust of cold, fresh air rushed inside, replacing the stale underground air. The exit was clear. He didn't hesitate. He ran. The sky burns. Ethan burst out onto the surface, his boots hitting cracked pavement. He was no longer in the ruins of the dead city. This was an old, abandoned airfield, stretching out in all directions, the remains of rusted ships and broken landing pads littering the area. Above, the night sky burned. Ships hovered above the ruins, not just his teams, but the purges. They had already landed forces. Ethan gritted his teeth. No escape. Not yet. His communicator flared again. "Carter, we see you. Hold position. We're bringing the ship down." Ethan barely had time to respond before he felt it. A change in the air. He turned, his body acting before his mind could process it. A plasma shot burned past him, missing him by inches. The purge soldiers had found him. They advanced across the airfield, their sleek black armor reflecting the red glow of their weapons. Their leader stepped forward, visor glinting under the faint light. "Human, you have defied the directive of the purge." Ethan slowly lowered the baby to the ground behind him, shielding it with his body. "And what directive is that?" The leader's voice was cold. "The eradication of anomalies." Ethan's pulse pounded. "You mean this child?" He shook his head. "It's just a baby." The leader hesitated. Then his visor tilted slightly toward the baby. "It is older than your species." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What?" The purge leader stepped forward. "You think it is an infant, a helpless creature. But it is not. That is why it was left here. That is why it was abandoned." Ethan's mind raced. It didn't make sense. He looked down at the baby. It looked like an infant. Small, fragile, scared. How could it be anything else? And then it looked up at him. And for the first time, Ethan felt something in his mind. Not words, not images, but understanding. Not a child, not an anomaly. Something else. The baby wasn't a baby. It wasn't something that had been abandoned out of cruelty. It had been sealed away, because it was too powerful. The purge leader raised his weapon. "Step aside, human. You do not understand what you are protecting." Ethan clenched his fists. "Maybe not. But I know one thing." His ship descended from the sky, its engines roaring. His team had finally arrived. "If you want this child, you'll have to go through me." The purge leader hesitated, his golden visor reflecting the growing intensity of the moment. Then, with an almost regretful tone, he spoke. "So be it." The soldiers opened fire. Ethan grabbed the baby, shielding it with his arms as he ran toward his ship. Plasma shots screamed past him, exploding against the ground, sending shards of metal and stone flying. Then the baby cried again. Only this time, it wasn't a normal cry. It was a pulse of energy, a shockwave that erupted outward. The purge soldiers staggered, clutching their heads, their armor flickering as if something had disrupted their very existence. Ethan's team opened fire from the ship, covering him. The purge leader recovered faster than the others. He lifted his weapon, aiming directly at Ethan. One last shot. Ethan turned. The shot never came. Because the hunter had appeared between them. The purge leader hesitated, his weapon shaking slightly. The hunter stared at Ethan. Then, without a word, it turned to the purge leader and spoke. "You are wrong." The purge leader flinched. "What?" The hunter did not repeat itself. Instead, it turned toward Ethan and stepped aside. Ethan's heart pounded. What the hell was happening? The hunter had been his enemy, but now it was letting him go. The purge leader's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You betrayed the directive." The hunter tilted its head. "No, I choose to see." Then, Before the purge soldiers could recover, Ethan ran up the loading ramp of his ship, gripping the baby tightly. As the doors sealed shut, Harris's voice came over the comms. "We're out of here." The ship blasted into the sky, leaving the battlefield behind. Ethan collapsed against the wall, heart racing. The baby nestled against him, its tiny hands gripping his shirt. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know why the purge feared it. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The final stand. The ship roared through the sky, leaving the battlefield below in flames. Ethan leaned against the cold metal wall of the cargo bay, still gripping the child in his arms. His breath was heavy, his heart pounding. The baby had stopped glowing. Its tiny body felt warm against his chest, but its strange, four glowing eyes were dim. It was exhausted. So was Ethan. Harris's voice crackled through the ship's speakers. "Ethan, we're clear of the planet's atmosphere. The purge isn't following. Yet." Ethan exhaled. Yet. Because they would come. And next time, they wouldn't just send a team of soldiers. They would bring everything. "Something is coming." Ethan gently laid the child down on a small medical cot, his hands shaking. His crew stood around him, silent. None of them knew what to say. They had seen the power this child had unleashed. They had seen how even the purge's deadliest hunter had hesitated. Harris crossed his arms. "So, what the hell do we do now?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Because he didn't know. The baby stirred slightly, its small fingers curling against the sheets. It looked up at him, eyes blinking slowly. And for the first time, Ethan felt something in his mind. Not words, not a voice. A feeling. Sadness, confusion, pain. Ethan's stomach tightened. This child, whatever it wasn't a monster. It was afraid. He crouched beside the cot, brushing a hand over its tiny forehead. "You're safe now, kid," he muttered. The baby blinked again. Then, for the first time, it reached out. Ethan hesitated, then took its tiny hand in his. And in that moment, he saw visions of the past. Ethan wasn't on the ship anymore. He was somewhere else. A vast, endless city of light stretched before him. Towers of glass and metal floated in the air, shifting and moving like living things. The sky was not a sky at all, but an infinite ocean of stars, swirling and bending around the massive structures below. Then, screams. The vision shifted. The great city was burning. Explosions erupted through the sky, fires consuming the once pristine world. Ships rained down from above, giant, black vessels, marked with the purge insignia. Ethan saw figures running. Tall, slender beings, the same species as the child. They were fighting, dying. They were trying to protect something. Then a vision focused on one thing. A chamber. Massive, ancient. Symbols glowed on its walls. And in the center, a single, small pod. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The baby. The truth of the child. Ethan jolted back into reality. His hands trembled as the vision faded, and the baby's grip on his fingers slowly loosened. He staggered back, his mind racing. The baby wasn't abandoned. It wasn't a mistake. It was the last of its kind. A species so powerful that even the purge, with all their technology and warriors, had been terrified of them. And so, they had wiped them out. All of them. Except this one. Ethan's crew exchanged nervous glances. Harris finally broke the silence. "Ethan, you okay?" Ethan shook his head, still trying to process it all. He looked down at the baby. Its eyes were wide, watching him. It knew he had seen. And then, another realization hit him. The purge hadn't followed them. Not because they had given up, but because they were already waiting. The ambush. The ship's alarms screamed. War in Ing. Multiple vessels detected. Ethan's stomach dropped. He sprinted toward the cockpit just as the ship's external cameras flickered to life. A fleet. Not one or two ships. Dozens. The Purge had already positioned themselves outside the planet's orbit, waiting for them to run. And now, they were surrounded. Harris cursed. They must have predicted where we'd go. We can't fight that many ships. Ethan's fists clenched. We don't have to fight them. We just need to get the hell out of here. The comms crackled. A cold, familiar voice came through. Surrender the anomaly. This is your final warning. Ethan stared at the screen. The Purge commander's visor gleamed like a predator waiting for the kill. His crew looked at him, waiting. Ethan's pulse pounded. His ship was fast, but not faster than an entire fleet. And even if they somehow escaped, the Purge would never stop hunting them. There was only one way out. His eyes flicked toward the baby. It was watching him, as if it already knew what he was about to do. The final choice. Ethan's mind raced. He had a choice to make. 1. Surrender the baby. The Purge would take it. End their pursuit. Let his crew live. 2. Fight. Certain death. No way they could win. 3. Do the impossible. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. He turned to Harris. Plot a course for deep space. Get ready to jump. Harris's eyes widened. Are you insane? We won't make it. Ethan ignored him. He walked to the baby's cot, crouched down, and whispered, I need your help. The baby blinked. Then, slowly, it reached out its tiny hands and touched the ship's floor. The air shifted. A strange humming noise filled the ship. And then, suddenly, the entire fleet outside flickered. For just a moment, space itself seemed to bend. The Purge commander's voice came through again, this time with panic. What are you doing? The baby's eyes glowed brighter. Then, everything went dark. A new beginning. When Ethan opened his eyes, the alarms had stopped. The screens were blank. The ship was silent. Harris gasped. "W where?" Ethan looked at the navigation system. They were light years away. Not just far from the Purge fleet, far from everything. The baby had done something, moved them across space in an instant. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. I don't believe it. The baby let out a small coo. Ethan picked it up, cradling it against his chest. He stared out into the endless void. The Purge would never stop hunting them. But now, they had a chance. He looked down at the child and whispered, "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time, the baby smiled.